Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're all doing great. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing folks from all over the place tuning in. The hot wind kicked up spirals of dust along the red dirt road as Clara Mitchell's old pickup truck sputtered to a halt in the middle of nowhere. The engine coughed once, twice, then exhaled a thick puff of white smoke before falling silent, like an old horse finally giving up the fight. No. Please don't, Clara muttered, wrenching the steering wheel as if she could coax the battered machine forward. But it only shuddered once and died, baking under the brutal midday sun. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she gasped for breath, scanning the horizon. Fields scorched brown stretched endlessly in every direction. No cars, no people, no cell signal. Silver Creek Ranch, her family's last piece of land, was just about 7 miles west. But in the western heat, 7 miles could feel like forever. Clara popped the hood, choking on the plume of smoke that rose like a white flag of surrender. Frowning, she peered inside, but the old truck refused to give up its secrets. With a sigh, she leaned heavily against the side of the vehicle, staring down the dusty road ahead. And then, through the shimmering heat waves, a figure appeared. A man on horseback. Clara squinted. He looked like he'd ridden straight out of an old Western novel. A faded denim shirt, a weathered wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a dust-stained bandana knotted around his neck. The black horse moved with an easy, rhythmic clop over the cracked earth, and somehow, despite the desolation, Clara felt a strange, surprising comfort. When he was just a few yards away, the stranger pulled his horse to a slow halt, pushing back his hat to reveal deep-set eyes, the color of rich soil after rain, the kind of eyes that made Clara unconsciously tighten her grip on her keys. "Truck trouble?" he asked, voice rough as wine through canyon walls. Clara nodded stiffly, her body locked between caution and something else she couldn't quite name. "I might be able to help," he offered, adjusting the reins. "Name's Daniel." "Clara," she answered, almost involuntarily, then immediately regretted it. Why was she giving her name to a complete stranger in the middle of nowhere? Daniel slid off his horse in one smooth, practiced move and approached the truck without another word. He pulled a worn cloth and an old screwdriver from the saddlebag, strapped to his horse. Clara crossed her arms, watching him work. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, not like the rushed, half-hearted mechanics she'd paid before. It was almost like he was talking to the truck, not fixing it. "Fan's shot," Daniel said finally, wiping his hands. "Radiator's bone dry. She's not going anywhere." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of it settle deep in her chest. No car, no phone, no help for miles. She'd always been tough, managing alone in this dusty town, fighting off the vultures eager to snatch up her family's land. But here, under the endless, empty sky, she felt impossibly small. "My ranch," she said quietly, "Silver Creek. About 7 miles west." Daniel nodded like he'd already known. "My horse can carry 2, he said after a pause. "It won't be comfortable." Clara clutched the truck keys tighter. Trust a stranger, or risk collapsing halfway across a desert under a merciless sun. She looked into his eyes, steady, unreadable, unhurried, and found her answer. She nodded. Daniel quickly secured his gear and tightened the saddle. He patted the horse's flank and extended his hand toward her. Clara hesitated for just a moment, then took it. In one firm pull, Daniel hoisted her up behind him. The black horse started off at a slow, steady pace, the dust swirling around them, the rhythm of hooves echoing like a heartbeat. Clara could smell the sweat of the horse, the dry earth, and the faint scent of sun-worn fabric from Daniel's shirt. And somewhere deep inside, she realized, some decisions weren't made with logic. They were made with the trust you felt in your bones. She trusted the silent strength in his eyes. She trusted the firm but careful arm that kept her steady in the saddle. Together, they crossed the endless miles, slipping into the amber folds of the setting sun. As darkness crept across the land, they finally saw it, the soft, flickering light of Silver Creek Ranch. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Daniel pulled the horse to a stop by the old gate, where a sign still swung lazily in the wind. Silver Creek Ranch Est, 1924. "You're home," he said, voice almost a whisper. Clara slid down from the horse, her legs trembling. Fumbling with the gate, she finally turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, voice cracking slightly. Daniel simply nodded. He turned as if ready to mount up and disappear into the night, as if he had never been there at all. But before he could leave, Clara found herself calling out, Would you stay? I could use an extra hand around the ranch." Daniel paused, silhouetted by the rising moon. For just a moment, Clara thought she saw a tired, gentle smile ghost across his face, a smile full of ache and kindness. "Just for a little while," he said. And with that simple offer, made in the middle of nowhere, under a sky full of dust and stars, they laid the first fragile stones of something neither of them could yet name. A story about trust, a story about healing, a story about finding home in the most unexpected places. Morning light flooded Silver Creek Ranch, painting the weathered fences and dry fields with a soft honey glow. Clara pulled her worn jacket tighter around her shoulders, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, as she leaned against the front door frame of the main house. Across the yard, Daniel was fixing the old corral gate. She watched him from a distance, every movement steady, measured, unhurried, yet purposeful. The way he swung the hammer, the way he paused every so often to pat Dusty, the old horse nosing curiously out of the stable. It stirred something slow and quiet inside her, something balanced precariously between suspicion and something dangerously close to fondness. It had been 3 days since Daniel first appeared, and he hadn't left. He didn't talk much, just worked, silent and dependable, as if he belonged here all along. Clara knew that in a land like this, silence was often worth more than promises. Still, some part of her couldn't help but wonder. Who was he really? And what was he running from? One scorching noon, Clara found Daniel behind the barn, wrestling an old saddle off a stubborn young colt. "How's Whiskey behaving?" she called out, half joking, half worried. Daniel tightened the lead rope with one hand while easing the saddle off with the other. "Just needs patience," he said, voice low and even. "Same as people." Clara smiled, those short, grounded answers so typical of him. "Where'd you learn all that?" she asked lightly, the breeze carrying her words. Daniel stroked the colt's neck, his eyes never leaving the horse. "Here and there. Anywhere there's dust and restless souls, you'll find me." The vague reply only made Clara's curiosity deepen. She stood silent for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him there, outlined by the sun, his shadow stretching long across the brittle grass like a quiet question hanging in the air. That evening, a strange wind swept through the valley, rattling the windows and setting the horses restless in their stalls. Clara and Daniel moved through the ranch together, double-checking locks, reinforcing gates. When they reached the far corner, where the old fence met the edge of the woods, Daniel suddenly stopped. Clara stepped up beside him. "What is it?" Daniel was still, eyes scanning the ground, faint tire tracks fresh and deep. "Not strangers," he said quietly. "Someone who knows the land." Clara tightened her grip around the flashlight. Her heart raced. She knew only one man reckless enough to trespass in the dead of night, Ray Easton. Daniel tilted his head, listening. Far off, a faint engine noise, retreating. "We need better security," he said, voice rough but steady. "Starting tonight." Clara nodded. No dramatic speeches, no promises, just a simple truth, spoken like a post driven deep against a coming storm. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat in the dark, listening to the wind whip through the fences, jumping at every harmless sound. She thought of her father, the man who had taught her that real strength wasn't about standing alone. But when he died, Clara had forgotten that lesson, carrying the weight of the ranch and the world on her 2 young shoulders. Outside, the dim stable light still burned. Daniel was still out there, patrolling like a patient ghost. Clara gripped her cold tea tighter. Trust, she thought. Trust didn't come from flowery promises. It came from someone who stayed up at the gate while the rest of the world slept. By morning, Daniel had already driven 2 steel posts deep along the fence line and reinforced the stall locks. Clara brought him a fresh cup of coffee. He took it with a small nod, drinking slowly, like it was some rare, hard-earned privilege. "Are you always this ready?" she asked, half teasing, half serious. Daniel set the cup down on the windowsill, glancing up at the growing light. "I've known places where if you weren't ready, you had nothing left to protect." Clara heard it then, the weariness woven into his voice. The kind of tired that didn't come from long days or rough hands, but from loss. She didn't ask, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some stories weren't meant to be told aloud. They were told by bloodied hands still mending fences, by footsteps pacing the ranch lawn after midnight, by simply staying without needing to be asked. In that quiet, persistent way, Daniel had begun stitching thin threads of trust into the frayed corners of Clara's heart. That afternoon, as the sun softened and shadows stretched, Clara found Daniel by the dry creek bed behind the ranch, quietly sharpening an old hoe. She sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth, far enough to honor the spaces between old scars. "Do you ever think," she began hesitantly, "that some people are just meant to keep moving?" "Always." Daniel paused, studying the shimmer of sunset along the water. "Some maybe," he said, "but others, no matter how far they roam, they always find their way back to where they belong." Clara turned to look at him. Those deep, steady eyes offered no guarantees, no easy promises. Just the simple, solid fact of being there, patient, unwavering. Like this land itself, scorched and battered by storms, yet still waiting quietly for the rain. The early April winds whipped across Silver Creek, kicking up dust and rattling the aging fences. The trees bent low under the sudden cold gusts, as if the land itself was bracing for something ominous. Clara Mitchell stood on the front porch, a hand clutching a mug of steaming coffee, her eyes fixed on the distant hills. A strange heaviness pressed against her chest, as if the ground beneath her was shifting in silence. Daniel was out by the southern fence line, mending another broken post. Even without looking, Clara knew that if she turned her head, he would still be there, steady, silent, like an anchor holding firm against an unseen storm. Late that morning, a sleek black pickup truck rumbled slowly into the yard. The moment Clara heard the tires crunching over the gravel, a chill shot down her spine. A man stepped out, tall, sharply dressed, exuding the cold authority of someone used to giving orders. Perfectly tailored suit, polished leather boots, and a smile that never touched his eyes. Troy Easton. The name had been whispered enough times around these parts, in hushed warnings from other ranchers, in bitter mutterings about lost land. A businessman, they called him. A predator, more like. Clara tightened her grip on her mug, forced her voice to stay even as she stepped onto the porch. "Troy," she called out, flat and unimpressed. "Didn't expect you to come slumming out here yourself." Troy's mouth curved into a smirk as his gaze swept slowly over the ranch, already seeing it as his own. "Just visiting an old friend," he drawled, pulling a folded stack of papers from his jacket. "Thought I'd bring a golden opportunity, a way for you to walk away from all this." He waved his hand at the ranch as if it were a dying dog. Claire didn't need to look at the papers to know exactly what they were. "I'm not selling," she said, each word sharp and solid as stone. Troy's face darkened. "Come on, Clara. You know better than anyone. This place won't survive another summer. Broken pumps, dried out fields. You need cash. I'm offering you a way out." By now, Daniel had left the fence line and was making his way toward them. His steps were slow but deliberate, his presence unmistakable even at a distance. Troy flicked a glance at him, lowering his voice. "And if you don't take it, accidents tend to happen out here." A threat, wrapped in velvet. Clara felt the blood pound in her ears. Before she could answer, Daniel stepped up beside her, standing shoulder to shoulder, calm and unshakable. "You ever hear the saying, 'Uninvited guests don't stay long'?" Daniel said, voice low and steady. Troy narrowed his eyes, instantly realizing Daniel wasn't just some hired ranch hand. Still, he gave a tight, mocking grin and stuffed the papers back into his jacket. "Don't kid yourself," Troy sneered. "You can't save what's already crumbling." He turned, stalking back to his truck. "I'll be back," he threw over his shoulder. "And next time, I won't be offering nicely." The truck tore away, kicking up a trail of dust behind it. Clara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Daniel turned to her, voice gentle. "You okay?" Clara nodded, though her hands still trembled slightly. "I know men like him," Daniel said quietly. "They threaten when they think they're about to lose." Clara looked up into his eyes, steady, unflinching, full of a quiet certainty she hadn't realized how much she needed. In that moment, she knew, no matter what came next, she wouldn't be standing alone. That afternoon, the ranch fell into a heavy, charged stillness. Clara and Daniel checked every gate, reinforced every lock, quietly preparing for the worst. Between tasks, they kept up the rhythms of everyday life. Daniel cooked dinner, a simple beef stew that filled the house with rich, comforting smells. They ate in near silence under the warm glow of the kitchen lights, their shadows long on the walls. Now and then, Daniel would share stories of the far-off ranches he'd passed through, scattered, half-finished tales like broken fragments of a long road behind him. Clara didn't press for more. She just listened, because sometimes the silence between two people said more than any words ever could. That night, Clara sat wrapped in a blanket on the porch, staring up at the thin crescent moon hanging low over the black sky. Daniel stepped out, carrying 2 mugs of hot cocoa. He handed her one, then sat down beside her, saying nothing, asking nothing. They simply sat there, listening to the soft chorus of crickets and the whisper of wind through the grass. Clara tightened her hands around the warm mug. "I always thought," she said into the darkness, voice barely above a whisper, "that I had to carry everything alone. That if I fell, I'd have to fall alone too." Daniel said nothing. He simply reached out and laid his rough, calloused hand gently over hers, a touch more powerful than any spoken vow. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, for the first time in a long time allowing herself to simply rest. Maybe she thought, not every warrior was meant to fight alone. The sun sank behind the hills like a dying ember, painting the sky in a burning shade of orange. The wind swept across the parched fields, carrying the dry scent of scorched grass and cracked earth. Clara stood inside the old shed off the side of the ranch, searching for an old storm lantern to fix up for the stables. While shifting a few dusty boxes, she accidentally toppled a precarious stack. A small wooden box tumbled free, landing with a soft thud on the dirt floor. Drawn by a pull she couldn't explain, Clara knelt down. The box had a rusty little lock, but one corner was already broken open. She hesitated, then, with a heartbeat caught in her throat, lifted the lid. Inside were old documents, land deeds, and on top, a faded photograph. A young man with piercing, deep-set eyes and a stern, almost grim expression, standing proudly in front of a gleaming skyscraper. Clara flipped the photo over, scrawled on the back in shaky ink, "Daniel A. Hart, Heartland Tower Inauguration Day." Her heart seized. The name, too infamous to mistake. Heartland, once a towering real estate empire, brought down by tragedy after the untimely death of its founder and the mysterious disappearance of his heir, Daniel A. Hart. The man in the photograph, unmistakably, was Daniel. The man fixing her fences. The man brewing cocoa at night and quietly changing light bulbs in the barns. The man who held her hand when the cold winds swept through the fields. He had hidden it from her. No words, no hints. By the time Clara stepped out of the shed, the sky had darkened into deep twilight. She made her way straight to the stables, where she knew Daniel would still be working late. He was crouched by a loose wooden slat, sleeves rolled up, sweat dampening the back of his faded shirt. He looked up when he heard her approach, that familiar, easy smile flickering across his face. But it vanished the moment he caught the look in her eyes. Frozen, cold. "Clara," Daniel called, voice cautious. She said nothing, simply held out the photograph. Daniel's gaze dropped to the photo, then back up to her. He didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. Only silence hung between them, thick, heavy, like the storm clouds gathering overhead. "How long?" Clara asked, voice low and trembling. Daniel clenched his fists, then let them fall to his sides in defeat. "Since the first day," he rasped. Clara gave a hollow, broken laugh, the wind seeming to rip it from her chest. "You let me believe you were just some drifter, some lonely soul who happened to stumble through." Her voice cracked. "Someone I could—" She swallowed hard. "Trust." Daniel took a step closer. "I didn't mean to lie," he said, voice rough. "I just didn't know how to start. Didn't know how." Clara scoffed, bitter. "You're Daniel A. Hart. The entire country hunted for you like a ghost. You think I didn't deserve to know who was living under my roof?" Silence. Only the sound of the wind moaning through the gaps in the barn roof. "I know loss," Daniel said quietly. "I lost everything too." Clara shook her head, backing away. "It's not the same, Daniel," she whispered. "Not even close." She turned and walked away, each step feeling like she was carrying the weight of a world crumbling to ash behind her. That night, the ranch sank into a silence so heavy it was almost alive. Clara lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every half-truth, every careful smile, every sidestep conversation about the future. Now it all made sense, and somehow it hurt even more, because she had believed in someone who, it turned out, didn't even exist. The next morning, Daniel was gone. A single piece of paper sat on the kitchen table. "I'm sorry. I won't hurt you anymore." His handwriting, strong but shaking at the edges. Clara picked up the note, crushing it slightly in her tightening fingers. Part of her wanted to feel relief. He was gone. She was safe from his lies. But all she felt was empty. Days blurred into weeks. Clara fought alone to keep the ranch running. She patched leaking pipes, replaced worn irrigation lines, checked every lock and latch by herself at nightfall. But no matter how busy she kept her hands, no matter how stubborn she tried to be, she could not erase the memory of the man who once walked these fields beside her. The man who stood steady against the storms, expecting nothing in return. One evening, while clearing out the shed again, Clara found Daniel's old jacket still hanging behind the door. She pressed it to her face, breathing in the lingering scent of sweat, leather, and dust. And for the first time since he left, Clara cried. Not because of betrayal, but because she had lost something she hadn't even known she needed so desperately. A cold wind swept across the barren hills as Clara Mitchell pulled her truck over on the dusty back road, the wheels sinking slightly into the soft earth. Her wide-brimmed hat shielded half her face, but it couldn't hide the turmoil flickering in her eyes. Ahead of her, in the distance, stood a small roadside motel, the kind that clung stubbornly to the fringes of forgotten towns. The place where she'd heard a tall, quiet man was renting a room by the week. The man she had once driven away with her hurt. The man she now realized she couldn't fight without. Clara gripped the steering wheel tighter, breathing deep. She wasn't here for explanations, not to demand answers about old secrets. She was here for the future, if he was still willing. Inside the shabby lobby, the motel's owner, a woman in her 50s with hair like fireplace ash, peered up at Clara with curious eyes. "Looking for someone?" the woman asked, her voice rough as gravel. Clara clutched the strap of her worn leather bag. "Daniel Hart, room 3. The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly. Then she nodded, her expression softening. "Quiet fella," she murmured, "but kind." A small, unsteady warmth unfurled in Clara's chest. She walked the narrow hallway, boots tapping softly against the warped wooden floor. Stopping at room 3, she hesitated. What if he refused? What if he'd already left, not just in body, but in heart? She raised her hand and knocked. 3 soft raps. Silence. Then, slow, heavy footsteps. The door cracked open. Daniel stood there, looking just the same, sleeves rolled up, quiet storm in his eyes, solitude wrapped around him like a second skin. For a heartbeat, he froze, like a ghost he hadn't dared hope to see again. "Clara," he whispered. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall. "I need you," she said, plain and steady. "Not for what you were, for what we can build together." Daniel's eyes cracked like a frozen lake under a dropped stone. Ripples. Fractures. Without a word, he opened the door wider, and Clara stepped in. The room was spare, just a single bed, an old wooden desk, a battered pair of boots by the door, a worn leather jacket slung over a chair. On the desk, a map of Silver Bend spread out, red ink markings scattered across it. Clara recognized it immediately. Troy Easton, the man who had once threatened her, wasn't just after a ranch. He was coming for the entire valley. Quietly, patiently, buying up land piece by piece like a predator gnawing down its prey. Clara walked over, fingertips tracing the map. "How many families left?" she asked, voice low. Daniel hesitated. "Less than 10. She bit her lip, heart clenching. "How much time do we have?" Daniel looked at her, his voice low and rough. "Not much. If Easton signs the development contracts next month, the valley's gone." Clara clenched her fists, her breathing ragged. "We can't let that happen." Daniel moved closer, slow, as if afraid she might bolt again. "Clara," he said gently, "are you sure about fighting this war beside someone like me?" She lifted her eyes to his, clear and steady as a deep lake. "You were the only one who stood and fought for me when no one else would," she said. "Now, I choose to fight beside you." That night, they sat at the old desk, plotting their next moves. Clara wasn't the girl trembling over loss anymore. She was a warrior, with a heart shaped by every scar she carried. Daniel, with the sharpness of a man who had once run an empire, showed her how to trace Troy's corrupt dealings, hidden loans, disguised rezoning maps, fear-forged agreements. They laid out their targets. Gather the remaining families. Collect evidence. Bring in the local media. Between heated strategy sessions, small, fragile moments found their way through. Once, when Clara dozed off at the table, Daniel quietly draped his jacket over her shoulders. Another time, when Daniel wordlessly repaired the broken lock on her door, Clara watched him, feeling a strange, steady warmth bloom inside her. No grand promises were made. Only small acts, firm and unspoken. 2 days later, beneath the old birch tree where the town held community meetings, Clara and Daniel stood before a small but stubborn crowd. Clara gripped the microphone, her hand trembling slightly, but her voice steady. "There are those who want us to believe we've already lost," she said, her voice carrying into the hush. "That the land, the memories of our families, are nothing but numbers on a ledger." She paused, sweeping her gaze across the worn, weathered faces. "But we are still here, and as long as we draw breath, we have a choice." Behind her, Daniel stood tall, pride shining quietly in his eyes. That day, 12 families signed onto the class action lawsuit against Troy Easton. And Clara understood. It wasn't old wounds or hidden secrets that defined them. It was the choice they made today, the choice not to turn away, not to surrender, the choice to stand. The fire of unity. That afternoon, as the golden sun poured its honey light across the withered fields of Silver Bend, Clara stood on the worn wooden steps of the old community hall, gripping a folder as if it were the last thread of hope. A soft breeze swept across the land, stirring dust and brittle weeds, but within Clara, a quiet flame burned, small, stubborn, refusing to die. Daniel stepped up beside her, his hands tucked casually in his pockets, his eyes scanning the nearly empty parking lot, where a few battered pickup trucks sat baking under the sun. His face was calm, but Clara knew, beneath that stillness, a battle was raging. "Ready?" Daniel asked quietly. Clara took a deep breath. "We don't have another choice." He nodded and gently placed a hand on her back, a silent transfer of strength. The meeting began with barely 20 people, dusty ranchers, wives with flour still clinging to their aprons, children peeking shyly from behind their mother's skirts. The air was thick with hesitation, heavy with fear. Many were still haunted by Troy Easton, a man with money, power, and no hesitation to crush anyone in his way. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier. "We've lived on this land for generations," she began. "We've planted, raised, dreamed, and buried here. And now they want to take it from us, not by choice but by threat." Slowly, heads lifted, eyes turned toward her. Daniel stood right behind her, silent and steadfast, ready to catch her if she faltered. Clara lifted the folder, filled with evidence she and Daniel had gathered. Illegal documents, witness statements, shady contracts. "Troy Easton doesn't just want our land. He wants to erase our community, wipe away everything we've built with our sweat and blood." Her voice broke slightly at the end, and that, more than anything, silenced the crowd. An old man in a battered cowboy hat nodded slowly. A young mother gripped her husband's hand tighter. A spark flickered through the skepticism. After Clara's speech, as the sun dipped low against the horizon, the small group gathered around a rough-hewn wooden table. Daniel spread out a map of Silverbend, pointing to the areas Easton had already taken, the ones still in danger, the land that could still be saved. "We need to file a petition with the local court," he explained. "We need to prove Troy used threats and deceit." Mr. Simmons, a grizzled cattle rancher, frowned deeply. "And if he comes back," the old man rasped. "If he sends his men again?" Daniel looked him squarely in the eye, voice steady as bedrock. "Then this time, we won't be standing alone." Clara added, her voice warm but firm. "We can't fight him one by one, but together we can." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, like a single match struck in the dark, one hand rose. "Count me in." "And me." "For Silverbend." The voices grew stronger, steadier. The small fire of unity had been lit, and it burned bright. That night, Claire and Daniel sat on the porch of the community hall, looking out over the misty fields. Clara hugged a cold coffee cup between her hands, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her heart warmed. "I never thought," she mumbled, "I'd ever stand up like that." Daniel smiled, the moonlight softening the sharp lines of his face. "Sometimes," he said, "the strongest people are the ones who think they're the weakest." She turned toward him, catching that steady, quiet gleam in his eyes. "And you?" she asked. "Did you ever think you'd stop running?" Daniel was silent for a long time. "No," he admitted, "not until I met you." In that moment, there was no need for more words. Only the whisper of wind through the fields, and a sure feeling that, no matter how long the road ahead, they would never walk it alone again. The next day, the community hall was full. Clara and Daniel had printed materials, assigned tasks. Someone to reach out to the lawyer, someone to handle court filings, someone to bring the local press. Strong-backed men sawed wood and hammered signs reading "Not for sale" into the dirt in front of their ranches. Women prepared food and water for late-night watches. Children posted flyers, drew tiny flags with soaring birds, symbols of hope. There was no fear now, only determination. Late that night, after the dust had settled, Clara sat alone on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees, her mind swirling. Daniel came outside, carrying 2 sandwiches. "You need to eat," he said, sitting down beside her. Clara chuckled softly, taking the sandwich. They ate in silence, their gazes meeting now and then, shy as kids with new and unfamiliar feelings. "You think," Daniel finally said, "the little fire we lit today will burn bright enough?" Clara gazed out into the vast darkness where homesteads and fields leaned quietly on each other like an unbreakable community. "Not just bright enough," she whispered. "Bright enough to burn away every shadow." Daniel gently squeezed her hand, and under the endless stars, 2 wounded souls chose to stand together, ready for whatever would come next. The stormy night, when courage was forged in fire. The wind had begun howling even before dusk fell. Clara stood at the window, staring out at the fields drowning in a blood-red sunset. Heavy clouds hung low overhead, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Daniel stepped into the room, his jacket slung over one shoulder, an old rifle strapped across his back. He didn't say a word, just gave her a look, one that told Clara everything. What they had feared was finally here. A shrill phone ring shattered the heavy silence. Clara jumped and grabbed the receiver. "Clara, it's Sam from the horse farm up north. I spotted some strange trucks hanging around near your fence. We're on our way to back you up, but be careful." She thanked him, her voice shaking slightly. As she hung up, Daniel was already behind her, his hands gripping her shoulders firmly. "We're ready," he said, voice calm, but his eyes were razor-sharp. Clara nodded. Even though her heart thundered against her ribs, she knew she wasn't alone. Not anymore. As darkness swallowed Silver Bend, lanterns around the ranch flickered to life one by one. Daniel and Clara checked every door, every bolt. The horses in the barn grew restless, pawing at the ground and snorting anxiously. "Take Dusty and Moonlight out back by the stalls," Daniel ordered. "Make sure they're safe. Let me handle the outside." "Alone?" Clara frowned. Daniel gave a lopsided smile, half serious, half tender. "I'm not alone, remember?" Those simple words made Clara's throat tighten. No bows, no grand speeches, just action, just that look, and she knew she could trust him. Engines roared, tearing through the night. Clara yanked her hat down low and crouched behind the barn's wooden wall. Through a narrow gap, she watched as 4 pickup trucks skidded to a stop at the end of the path, headlights sweeping wildly over the trembling fences and dry earth. A group of men jumped out, dark clothes, masked faces, armed with bats and crowbars. Clara's stomach twisted into a knot. They were here. She peered toward the main house. Daniel moved like a shadow, silent, deadly. The wind screamed around them, kicking up dust that thickened the air into a choking haze. The crash of breaking glass rang out from the direction of the storage shed. The splintering of wood. The panicked whinny of horses. Clara couldn't stay hidden. Grabbing a nearby hoe, she sprinted forward. One of the attackers was smashing the barn gate. Clara screamed and swung the hoe with all her strength, striking him squarely on the shoulder. He staggered back, cursing, and Clara didn't hesitate. She slammed the barn door shut. Just then, another masked figure lunged at her. She braced herself, but before he could reach her, Daniel appeared from the shadows. With a single swift move, he threw the man down, then signaled for Clara to get back. "Protect the horses," he barked. There was a brief, electric pause. Clara retreated, throwing her arms around Moonlight's trembling neck, feeling the frantic heartbeat that mirrored her own. Out in the yard, Daniel faced 3 men alone. He didn't flinch. The first attacker charged. Daniel sidestepped and slammed his fist into the man's chin, sending him sprawling. The second swung a bat. Daniel absorbed the blow on his forearm and retaliated with a lightning-fast strike, knocking the man to the ground. The third pulled out a handgun. Clara screamed. Daniel spun, grabbed a nearby lantern, and hurled it at the man. Flames erupted across the masked figure, who dropped the weapon and bolted into the night, shrieking. In the distance, sirens wailed. Sam and the neighbors were coming. The intruders scrambled into their trucks and sped away. Daniel stumbled toward Clara, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes were bright and fierce. Clara rushed out of the barn, throwing aside the hoe, falling to her knees beside him. "You're hurt," she cried, her voice breaking. Daniel shook his head slightly. "It's nothing. Are you okay?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, the first since this battle began. "I'm okay, because you're here." He pulled her into his arms, not caring about the blood, the dust, the wounds. Only breath, only heartbeats pounding together. By the time the police arrived, Troy was long gone, leaving only wreckage and rage behind in Silver Bend. But that night, in the ranch's little kitchen, under the soft glow of a single lamp, Clara patched up Daniel's wounds. And they both understood, no matter what Troy brought next, they would not be broken. They had fought for every inch of land, every living soul, because this place was home, and family, even one forged without blood, was worth every sacrifice they could give. The morning after, rebuilding from the ashes. The first light of dawn slipped through the broken slats of the damaged barn roof, casting warm, golden rays across the battered land. It was a quiet reminder that no matter how long the night, morning would always come. Clara stood on the porch, clutching a cold cup of coffee in both hands. Her eyes swept over the scene before her. Shattered fences, scattered planks, a gate hanging crooked from its hinges. Even the barn wore a shroud of ruin. A wave of sorrow rose in her chest, but Clara pushed it down. She knew, if she let herself crumble now, everything they had fought for would collapse with her. Beside her, Daniel stepped up, his hair a tousled mess, a bandage wrapped around his forehead. He gave her a look that needed no words, the look of a man who had lost everything before, and still chosen to stand. "We need a fresh start," Daniel said, his voice rough from the long night. Clara tightened her grip on the mug, then exhaled slowly, letting go of the weight pressing down on her shoulders. "Not just repairs," she murmured. "We have to rebuild from the ground up." Daniel nodded. In the morning light, his eyes held a glint of something stronger than survival, vision. That morning, Clara and Daniel worked side by side, gathering debris, patching walls, hammering nails as if they were stitching a wounded body back to life. Each swing of the hammer, each clink of a nail, it wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. It was a declaration: we are still here. We will not fall. Hours later, Sam, their friend from the Northern Horse Farm, rode up with 3 other men. They came with tools, timber, and faces set with grim determination. "We heard," Sam said, dismounting. "No one in this town wants to see this ranch fall. If you need extra hands, we're yours." Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't expected unconditional help. She glanced at Daniel and caught a rare smile, soft, genuine, and almost aching. "We're rebuilding this place," Daniel said. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been lost like we were." That afternoon, the ranch rang with the sounds of hammers pounding, nails sinking into wood, and laughter cutting through the dust. Children raced through the fields. Women brought trays of fresh bread and coffee. And life, real, stubborn life, began to bloom again among the ruins. During a break, Clara sat on the porch steps, sipping cold water, watching it all. Daniel came over and handed her another cup. "What would you think," he asked casually, "if we turned this place into a healing center?" "For who?" Clara tilted her head, half teasing. "For anyone who's ever lost their way," Daniel said simply. "For kids without homes. For veterans who need somewhere to breathe again. For anyone looking for a place to start over." Clara stared into his eyes. In them, she didn't just see a man who had once been broken. She saw someone who had chosen, deliberately, to turn his pain into hope. "I think," she said slowly, "there's no one better to do that than us." Daniel chuckled softly, the sound of a single clear note at the start of a brand new symphony. Over the next few days, their plans took shape. They sectioned off the north field for equine therapy, a haven for autistic children and the elderly. To the south, Daniel sketched out small cabins for families who needed shelter. Each night, under the dim glow of the old kitchen lamp, they sat at the battered table, sketching maps on a brown butcher paper, debating layouts, arguing over tiny details, but always ending in laughter or quiet smiles. Whenever Clara grew overwhelmed, Daniel simply reached for her hand. "When you doubt," he would whisper, "just look around you." And every time she did, at the neighbors hammering nails, the children laughing, the horses grazing peacefully, she remembered. They had already done the impossible. One misty morning, Clara and Daniel stood beneath the old oak tree at the ranch's entrance. In their hands was a brand new wooden sign, the words carved deep and proud: "Silver Heart Ranch, a place for lost souls to find their way." Clara laid her palm gently on the sign, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "We turn pain into something beautiful," she whispered. Daniel placed his hand over hers, squeezing softly. "Not just beautiful," he said, "stronger than ever." And as they stood there together, watching the fields turning green again after the storm, Clara knew they hadn't just saved a piece of land. They had saved every broken heart that dared to hope again. The proposal, finding home in each other. That afternoon, the sky above Silver Heart Ranch was painted in warm shades of amber. Soft winds carried the scent of freshly cut grass and familiar pine wood through the valley. Clara stood by the old wooden fence, her fingers tracing the worn cracks along the rails, her eyes lost in the blazing horizon. A few steps away, Daniel tightened the reins on a young rescue horse from a neighboring farm. He didn't call her in for dinner like he usually did. Something different hung in the air, a silent anticipation, an unspoken promise, hovering between them. Clara turned back and caught Daniel watching her, a gaze both tender and fierce. Her heart thudded softly, like a distant drumbeat. "Come take a walk with me?" Daniel asked, his voice low and steady. Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. They strolled through the soft meadows, where the horses grazed lazily under the golden light. Every step they left in the damp earth felt like another mark on the long journey they had walked together. Daniel didn't speak much. He simply let the sounds of crickets and the whispering breeze fill the spaces between them. When they reached the old oak tree, the one that now held the ranch's new hand-carved sign, Daniel stopped. Clara opened her mouth to ask something, but Daniel turned to face her first, and in his eyes was a light she only saw during his rarest, truest moments. "From the day I met you," he began, voice rough with emotion, "I knew this wasn't just another stop along the road." Clara held her breath. "I used to have everything," Daniel continued. "Money, fame, but I never had a real place to call home. Not until you looked at me. Not for what I had, but for who I really am." Clara felt her throat tighten. Her hands curled into each other. Daniel slipped his hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn wooden box. No ribbons, no flashy wrapping. He flipped it open to reveal a simple silver ring, polished bright. If you looked closely, you could see a hand-etched inscription on the inside. "Where you are, that's home." No grandeur, no glitter, just a simple truth, carved deep like the years Daniel had carried it inside him. He knelt down on one knee, bathed in the soft fire of the setting sun. "Clara Mitchell," Daniel said, voice hoarse, "I don't need a castle or a grand cathedral. I just need you to walk beside me through the sunshine, through the storms, through every hard day. If you'll have me, I'll have the whole world. Will you marry me?" Clara stood frozen, tears glistening in her eyes. In that moment, 1,000 memories flooded her. Nights she cried alone in a broken barn. Mornings spent laughing over cold coffee, silly arguments about how to fix a fence, and all. The silent battles Daniel had fought just to stay beside her without ever asking for anything. She saw it all, and she knew. There was nothing left to doubt. Clara dropped to her knees, level with him. She took Daniel's rough hand in hers and squeezed it tightly. "You don't need a place to call home," she whispered. "You're home." Daniel's smile broke through, real, raw, unguarded. Clara nodded, her tears catching the last light of the dying sun. "Yes, Daniel Hart, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had always belonged there. The sun dipped fully behind the mountains, leaving the sky bathed in soft shades of indigo and violet. Daniel and Clara sat beneath the old oak tree, leaning against each other in a quiet embrace. No fancy promises, no cheering crowds, just the earth, the wind, and two hearts, once broken, now found. Far off, horses grazed peacefully, and a flock of sparrows chirped their way home. And in that simple, golden moment, Claire knew, they hadn't just found love. They had found belonging in each other's arms. A reborn heart, the birth of Heart's Haven. 1 year after Clara Mitchell said yes under the old oak tree, Silver Heart Ranch had transformed so profoundly that even the wind seemed to breathe with a new rhythm. That morning, Daniel and Clara stood side by side at the newly built ranch gate, where a hand-carved wooden sign now hung. Heart's Haven, every groove and letter carefully chiseled by Daniel's own hands over weeks of quiet dedication. Clara reached out and traced the carved letters with her fingers, feeling each small indentation like the heartbeat of something newly alive. This was no longer a place just for her or for Daniel. It was for anyone seeking a second chance. "I think your father would be proud," Daniel whispered. Clara squeezed his hand and nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. From early morning, the first arrivals began to trickle in. Not eager tourists or investors with briefcases full of paperwork, but everyday people. A limping veteran with an old crutch, a young mother cradling her baby, a shy orphan clinging to the hem of a social worker's coat. Each carried invisible baggage, losses, scars, dreams nearly extinguished. Daniel greeted them with a quiet nod, while Clara ushered each into the newly renovated main house. Once a crumbling wooden cabin, now a warm, welcoming shelter filled with soft blankets and gentle light. In the gardens, young volunteers pitched tents and built white wooden fences around the future horse therapy field. The southern pasture, once left barren after the storms, now bloomed with lavender and soft spring grass. "We really did it," Clara said, her voice thick with tears as she looked out over the scene. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow, smiling. "We're just getting started." That afternoon, a small ceremony was held under the old oak tree. No grand stages or blaring speakers. Just an old wooden guitar, a few cups of hot coffee, and the easy murmur of laughter. Clara stepped onto a simple wooden platform, gripping the microphone tightly. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "When my parents were alive," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "they believed this land wasn't just property. It was a place where broken hearts could find their way home. Today, because of all of you here, that dream is real." She paused, scanning the crowd, weathered faces, shining eyes. "We named this place Heart's Haven," Clara continued, tears glistening, "not just for our family name, but because every heart, no matter how battered, no matter how lost, deserve a place to heal and begin again." Applause rippled through the crowd, not loud, not raucous, but deep, warm, and full of unspoken embraces. In the back, Daniel smiled, the kind of smile that needed no words, proud, steady, and quietly radiant. That evening, the ranch glowed under soft golden lights. Long tables covered in simple cream cloths held plates piled high with home-cooked food, pies, roasted meats, fresh bread. A one-legged veteran told booming jokes to a group of wide-eyed kids. A young woman, once adrift across countless cities, danced barefoot under the stars, her laughter breaking free after years of silence. Daniel handed Clara a glass of beer as she leaned against the porch rail. "Been a long time since I felt an evening like this," he said, passing her the glass. Clara clinked hers gently against his, her eyes sparkling. "And it all started with a broken-down truck in the middle of the desert," she teased. Daniel chuckled. "And a stubborn woman who refused to give up." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, letting the music and laughter swirl around them like a soft, invisible breeze. But deep down, they both knew the real journey had only just begun. Not every day would be filled with laughter. There would be, and already had been, days of tears, new arrivals carrying wounds too deep, children too afraid to trust, souls too fragile to believe they deserved a home. Daniel and Clara were ready for that, not with grand strategies or endless funding, but with open hearts. With hastily made dinners, sleepless nights by hospital beds, and silent embraces when no words could ease the pain. Because they knew healing wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about walking through it, together, one trembling step at a time. Late that night, when the ranch had fallen quiet under a sky dusted with 1,000 stars, Clara and Daniel sat beside the dying embers of the campfire. The moon hung low, casting a dreamy silver glow across the earth. Clara rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, her eyelids heavy. "Do you think we're strong enough for this?" she whispered. Daniel tightened his arm around her, the firelight flickering in his steady gaze. "We don't have to be strong all the time," he said softly. "We just have to be brave enough not to give up." Clara smiled faintly, lacing her fingers through his under the thin blanket. And there, in that quiet night, among the whispers of the fields and the crackle of cooling embers, two once-lost souls found what mattered most. A home, a community, and a love strong enough to rescue even the most shattered hearts. Heart's Haven wasn't the end of the story. It was a promise that no matter how broken you are, You are always worthy of a new beginning. The morning of a new beginning, Heart's Haven reborn. The morning sun crawled slowly over the low hills, casting long shadows across the valley of Heart's Haven. Dew clung to the young blades of grass, sparkling like 1,000 tiny diamonds woven into the green. Clara Mitchell stood before the main house, her worn leather gloves gripping a heavy hammer. The early sunlight caught in her hair, setting it aglow with a soft, golden hue, a silent greeting from the earth and sky. Beside her, Daniel Hart pulled a taut rope across the ground, marking the line for the new fence. "The first day of a new beginning," he said, his voice hoarse from long nights of preparation. Clara smiled, tightening her grip on the hammer. "Dreams aren't handed to us," she said. "We have to build them with our own hands." Daniel nodded, his eyes lighting up like the rising sun behind them. The work began with heavy wooden posts, driven deep into the earth, anchoring their resolve to stand firm through any storm. Neighbors and former residents of Heart's Haven, people who had found healing there, returned to help. Each carried a story, a scar, and a hammer. Wallace, the elderly veteran who had nearly lost his life overseas, now slowly but steadily pushed a wheelbarrow full of cement. Young Maggie, once a homeless wanderer after losing her mother, carefully nailed directional signs with small but determined hands. With each section of fencing completed, cheers and laughter broke out, echoing across the land, rising up to touch the wide, open sky. Clara wiped the sweat from her brow, her gaze sweeping over every face. They weren't just rebuilding a ranch. They were rebuilding themselves. By midday, everyone gathered under the big eucalyptus tree for a break. Daniel arrived with a cooler full of ice-cold water bottles and brown paper-wrapped sandwiches. No one stood on ceremony. Calloused hands passed sandwiches from one to another, sharing a kind of silent love. A small boy, maybe 8 years old, plopped down beside Clara, chomping on a sandwich and flashing a wide, toothy grin. "I want to build a horse barn," he said excitedly. Clara ruffled his hair. "Then tomorrow," she said, "we'll start with your barn." The boy's eyes lit up like a whole new sky had opened above him. Daniel watched from a distance, a slow ache of emotion blooming in his chest. No grand speeches were needed. A moment like that was enough to know every struggle was worth it. In the afternoon, they split into teams, one group fixing the old barn roof, another digging drainage trenches for the new garden. The wind picked up, swirling red dust into the air. Still, no one stopped. Daniel climbed onto the roof, gloves caked with dirt and sap, signaling for Clara to pass up new planks. 1, 2, 3, Clara shouted as she and Maggie shoved the heavy board upward against the wind. Daniel caught it and hammered it down with strong, steady blows. Each strike of the hammer rang out like the heartbeat of Heart's Haven, proclaiming to the world that they would not fall. That evening, little lanterns flickered to life around the ranch. A simple feast was laid out: buttery biscuits, sizzling roast meats, steaming pots of stew spiced with warmth. Clara sat wrapped in a blanket on the front porch, watching the children play in the cooling night air, their laughter floating like music across the valley. Daniel approached, hands tucked in his pockets, his face weary but full of quiet joy. "Not bad for first day," he said. Clara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Not bad. For a beginning," she whispered. That night, when everyone was fast asleep, Daniel and Clara walked the length of the newly built fence. The moon bathed the posts in silver light, turning them into silent pillars of hope. Daniel stopped, resting his hand on one of the posts, his face thoughtful. "I used to think," he said quietly, "that the things I lost could never be found again." Clara slipped her hand into his. "We're not reclaiming the past," she answered. "We're building a future, a better one." Daniel turned to her, gratitude shining in his eyes. "And I don't want to build it with anyone else but you," he murmured. Clara smiled, bright and radiant, as if the entire valley were blooming beneath the moonlight. The next morning, the sound of hammers rang out once again. A new group of volunteers arrived: a single mother with 2 young children, an old carpenter, a teenager fresh out of rehab. Each brought a story. Each bore scars, and each found a small piece of ground to begin again. Daniel and Clara stood on the porch, hand in hand, watching it all unfold. No words were needed. Their dream, a dream built with calloused hands, sweat, quiet perseverance, and unspoken love, was growing stronger by the day. Not with fanfare, not with grand declarations, but with every nail driven, every beam raised, every smile shared, step by steady step, toward the light. And that was the true miracle. A storm-tested heart, Heart's Haven stands. The peaceful days at Heart's Haven flowed like cool water after a long storm. Children laughed beneath the old eucalyptus trees. Veterans tended the communal gardens in silence. And Clara and Daniel often sat side by side on the porch, hand in hand, gazing out at the land they had saved with blood, sweat, and unwavering courage. But every dream must face another trial, as if fate itself must test whether we are truly worthy of what we've built. And this trial bore the name Troy Easton. The news arrived on a gusty morning as Clara swept out the horse barn and Daniel inspected the fences. A thick yellow envelope had been shoved under the front door. Clara opened it, her hands trembling slightly when she recognized the embossed seal of a law office. A lawsuit. Troy Easton, relentless as ever, had filed a claim in county court, alleging that part of Heart's Haven sat on disputed ownership he had secretly acquired through shadowy banking deals. An old scheme, dressed in slicker legal clothing. More dangerous this time. Daniel crushed the envelope in his fist. "It's not the land he wants," Daniel said, voice dark. "He wants to crush hope itself." That evening, Clara called an emergency meeting at the newly built community house. Warm yellow light spilled from the string lights strung along the wooden ceiling. Everyone came, from silver-haired elders to children clutching their mothers' hands, their shadows etched across the walls like the beating heart of the town itself. Daniel stood before them, his voice low and steady. "We built this place with our own hands. But if we don't stand together now, he'll take not just our land. He'll take our dignity and our dreams." Silence. Then Wallace, the old veteran, rose on his cane, voice gravelly but unbreakable. "We fought for freedom on foreign soil. Damned if we'll surrender it on our own." Applause erupted, growing louder and stronger, sweeping through the room like a wave of resolve. They would not back down. Not this time. In the days that followed, Heart's Haven became a silent battleground. Daniel worked with a team of volunteer lawyers, people who had heard about Heart's Haven and came without asking for anything in return. Clara organized community workshops, gathering signatures, creating videos to tell the ranch's story. Each day, Daniel still inspected the fences, still mended broken gates, still reminded the kids to wear boots in the garden. Only one thing had changed. His gaze now carried a quiet vigilance, like a man ready for the final fight. One late night, Clara brought him a mug of hot peppermint tea. He was hunched over a table, poring through dusty land records, marking disputed parcels in red. She sat beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Tired?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled, a fleeting thing, like moonlight skimming across still water. "Tired," he admitted, but never more certain. Clara squeezed his hand. "I'm here," she whispered. No grand speeches, no promises, just a simple truth, strong as the fence posts they'd hammered into this land. The day of the trial, the whole community packed into battered pickup trucks carrying hand-painted signs. Every document presented, from faulty land deeds to witness testimonies. Daniel painted a picture so clear even the walls seemed to lean in and listen. Troy Easton's deals weren't just illegal. They were nothing short of a naked land grab. Most of the trial passed in heavy silence. Only the eyes spoke. Eyes that had once known fear, now steeled with determination. Eyes of people pushed to the edge and who refused to fall. Finally, after 3 grueling days, the judge gave the ruling. Troy Easton lost. Heart's Haven would stay. The courtroom exploded into applause, relieved gasps, and tears bursting forth like a long-dammed river breaking free. Troy stormed out, his shadow trailing long and bitter across the cold courthouse floor. Clara grabbed Daniel's hand tightly. He turned to her, those deep blue eyes brimming with fierce certainty. "We did it," he whispered. "No," Clara said, her voice thick with joyful tears. "We became what this land always needed us to be." That night, Heart's Haven blazed like a beacon. The townsfolk gathered around a roaring bonfire, guitars strumming old songs about wild horses, rolling hills, and hearts too stubborn to surrender. Daniel sat beside Clara, one arm slung around her, the other tapping gently to the music. In the firelight, they looked at each other, no words necessary, and knew. From this moment on, every scar would be a sacred part of the home they fought to protect. A celebration of Heart's Haven's promise. The peaceful days at Heart's Haven flowed like cool water after a long storm. Children laughed under the eucalyptus trees, veterans tended the communal gardens in silence, and Clara and Daniel often sat on the porch, hand in hand, watching over the land they had saved with blood, sweat, and unwavering courage. But every dream must face another trial, as if fate needed to test if we are truly worthy of what we've built. And this time, the test bore a familiar name, Troy Easton. The news came on a windy morning, while Clara was sweeping out the barn and Daniel was checking the fences. A thick yellow envelope lay shoved under the front door. Clara opened it, her fingers trembling slightly when she saw the embossed seal of a law office. A lawsuit. Troy Easton, still unwilling to surrender, had filed a claim in court alleging that part of Heart's Haven sat on disputed ownership he had secretly purchased through shady bank deals. An old ploy, dressed in newer, more dangerous legal clothes. Daniel crushed the envelope in his hand. "He doesn't want the land," Daniel said, his eyes darkening. "He wants to crush hope." That evening, Clara called an emergency meeting in the newly built community house. The warm light from stringed bulbs bathed the rough wooden walls in a soft glow. Everyone came, from the silver-haired elders to the children clutching their mother's hands, every face etched with silent determination. Daniel stood before them, his voice low and steady. "We built this place with our own hands, but if we don't stand together, they won't just take our land. They'll take our dignity, our dreams." Silence filled the room. Then Wallace, the old veteran, rose on his cane, voice gravelly but strong. "We fought for freedom in foreign lands. Damned if we surrender here at home." Applause erupted, growing louder, a wave of warmth and resolve crashing over everyone. They would not back down. Not this time. In the days that followed, Heart's Haven became a quiet battlefield. Daniel worked with a team of volunteer lawyers from the city, people who had heard about Heart's Haven and came without being asked. Clara organized community workshops, collected petition signatures, filmed videos telling their story. Every day, Daniel still checked the fences, still hammered back loose boards, still reminded the kids to wear their boots. But something had changed. His eyes now carried a quiet readiness, like a man braced for the final stand. One night, Clara brought him a cup of peppermint tea. He sat at the kitchen table, old land deeds and maps spread out before him, red pen marks tracing their fragile claim. She slid beside him, laying her head gently on his shoulder. "Tired?" she asked. Daniel gave a small, tired smile, like the brief flicker of a candle against the dark. "Tired," he admitted, but never more sure. Clara squeezed his hand. "I'm here," she whispered. No fanfare, no promises, just a simple truth, strong and steady like the fence posts they had sunk into the earth. The day of the hearing, the community loaded into their battered trucks and rolled into the county courthouse, carrying hand-painted signs. "We're not selling hope. Heart's Haven is our home." In the small courtroom, Troy Easton strutted in, polished suit gleaming, a smug smile plastered across his face. He didn't even glance at Clara or Daniel. He thought he had already won. But Daniel took the stand, thick file in hand. Piece by piece, through contracts, testimonies, and old survey maps, he revealed the truth. Troy's claims were illegal, his deals deceitful. The courtroom was heavy with silence. Only the eyes spoke. Eyes of people who had once feared, now burning with resolve. Eyes of those who had been pushed to the brink and refused to fall. Finally, after 3 grueling days, the judge ruled. Heart's Haven would stand. Troy Easton lost. The courtroom erupted. Applause, tears, relieved laughter breaking like a dam that had held too long. Troy stormed out, his shadow trailing thin and hollow across the courthouse floor. Clara clutched Daniel's hand tightly. He turned to her, blue eyes brimming with fierce, steadfast pride. "We did it," he whispered. "No," Clara said, tears gleaming. "We became what this land always needed." That night, Heart's Haven blazed with light. The community gathered around a roaring bonfire. Guitars strummed old songs about wild horses, open fields, and stubborn hearts that refused to yield. Daniel sat beside Clara, arm wrapped around her shoulders, tapping his fingers gently to the music. In the firelight, they looked at each other, and no words were needed. From that night on, every scar would become a sacred thread woven into the fabric of their home. The heart reborn, the true spirit of Heart's Haven. One early autumn morning, with dew clinging to the grass and the sky bathed in a soft gray, Heart's Haven awoke to a symphony of life. The clatter of hooves, children's laughter under the eucalyptus trees, and the distant strumming of an old guitar on the porch. Clara Mitchell stood on the wooden steps, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, gazing at the scene before her. Children running through the garden beds, their footsteps drumming the earth like little heartbeats. Not far away, Daniel Hart was teaching a young veteran, his right arm still bandaged, how to gentle a skittish rescue colt. The young man's face, once clouded with darkness and pain, now shone with quiet determination. Clara smiled. Heart's Haven had truly changed, not just the rebuilt fences or the blooming fields, but in every heart that had found a home here. Over a year ago, it had just been Clara and Daniel. Now, every night around the long oak table, they had to pull up extra chairs. For orphans sent by care organizations. For veterans still healing invisible wounds. For lost souls who had finally found their way home. They didn't share blood, but they shared something stronger, a yearning to belong and to be loved. "Charlie, don't climb the water barrel," Clara called out, half laughing, half exasperated as the curly-haired 8-year-old tried to hoist himself up. "I'm just checking for fish," Charlie yelled back, his dirt-smudged cheeks glowing with mischief. Daniel, passing by, scooped the boy up effortlessly with one arm and murmured, "If you want to catch fish, I'll take you to the creek tomorrow. There's plenty there." Charlie's eyes lit up. "Really, mister?" "Daniel." Daniel ruffled his hair and nodded. Here at Heart's Haven, a promise is a vow. That evening, after a hearty dinner, everyone gathered around the outdoor fire pit. Under the crackling firelight, stories were shared of lost loves, long, lonely journeys, and silent battles fought inside the soul. Hank, an older veteran who had lost his wife and 2 children in a tragic accident, strummed a worn guitar and sang an old folk song that left the crowd hushed and reverent. Charlie fell asleep, curled against Clara's lap, and Daniel gently draped a thick wool blanket over them both. In that moment, Clara glanced up and caught Daniel's gaze. No words were needed. She knew he felt it too, the overwhelming truth. They had built a family, not through shared bloodlines or matching histories, but through shared hope and enduring love. One frosty morning, a small but powerful event unfolded at Heart's Haven. Lily, a shy 13-year-old who had spent most of her life shuffling between cold city shelters, carefully hung a wooden sign by the ranch gate. In her wobbly but proud handwriting, she had written, "Home is where your heart finds peace." Daniel stood silently nearby, his eyes shimmering. He had never imagined that a life torn apart by loss and anger could be rebuilt. Through a simple wooden sign, through a child's smile, through hands that had learned how to hold without hurting. Clara came up behind him, slipping her hand into his. "You brought your heart home," she whispered. Daniel squeezed her hand. "No," he said softly. "You and everyone here taught me how to find it again." Life at Heart's Haven wasn't always easy. There were long nights when Daniel sat on the porch, listening to the muffled sobs of children battling nightmares. There were endless rainy days, patching leaky roofs and rescuing flooded crops. There were moments when Hank would flinch at the rumble of thunder, his eyes lost in old grief. But every morning they brewed coffee, pulled weeds, and laughed together among the rows of new seedlings, because they no longer fought alone. And in those simple, stubborn acts of care, a true family was born, quietly, deeply, like roots pushing deeper into the earth. That winter, Hearthaven celebrated its first Christmas. No grand tree, no blinking lights. Just evergreen branches strung along the porch, golden lanterns casting soft halos, and hand-knitted stockings hanging by the fireplace. Children made handmade cards for one another. The adults brought firewood to share. On Christmas Eve, as everyone gathered around the bonfire, Daniel stepped forward, a small cloth-wrapped box in hand. He knelt before Clara, in front of their ever-growing family. Inside the box wasn't a diamond ring, just a simple silver band with a single inscription carved inside. Family is a choice. Tears filled Clara's eyes, not because of the ring itself, but because of everything it stood for. Faith, patience, forgiveness, love, the love they had built with their own battered but steadfast hearts. She nodded, whispering yes. The ranch erupted in cheers, whoops, and joyous laughter. Children danced. Hank played a jubilant tune on his guitar. And under the starlit sky, Hearthaven shone like a lighthouse against the darkness. That night, sitting by the dying fire, their fingers intertwined, Clara leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder. "Hey," she whispered, "do you think our family will keep growing?" Daniel kissed the top of her hair, smiling. "As long as there are hearts searching for a home," he said, "Hearthaven will always have room." And in that golden firelight, beneath the vast, forgiving sky, a silent promise was etched. Here, no one would ever be alone again. No bloodlines required. Only love. Final chapter, where dreams take root. The golden light of late afternoon spilled like warm honey across the hills surrounding Hearthaven, painting the barley fields with a tender, amber glow. A gentle breeze carried the scent of dry grass, freshly tilled earth, and wildflowers through the valley. Clara stood by the white wooden fence, her hand gripping a leather rein, her eyes following the horses grazing lazily in the field. Beside her, Daniel walked up slowly, hands tucked into his pockets, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "Today is beautiful," Clara whispered. Daniel looked around, at the children chasing each other through the garden beds, at the veterans tending to the vegetables, at the once-lost souls who had found their rhythm again, and nodded. "Beautiful," he said, "just like you." Clara laughed softly, a blush creeping across her cheeks, but inside her chest bloomed a pure, steady happiness she had once believed forever lost. That evening, Hearthaven held its very first fall festival. No grand banners, no booming speakers. Just strings of warm golden lights wrapped around the ancient trees, long wooden tables overflowing with apple pies, roasted corn, and steaming pots of stew. Children scrambled to set up chairs, adults carried dishes with laughter in their voices, and the autumn breeze wove their joy into the fabric of the night. Clara stood before the crowd, Daniel's hand firmly wrapped around hers. She took a deep breath. "We didn't all come from the same places," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "We weren't born into the same families. But tonight, we found each other." A warm ripple passed through the gathering. Faces once etched with grief now shone with quiet pride. "We chose each other," Clara said, "with trust, with hands that reached out when another stumbled, with hearts no longer afraid to be hurt." She paused, feeling Daniel's steady presence beside her. "Family isn't just blood," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "It's where lost hearts find each other and choose to stay." Applause burst forth across Hearthaven, rising into the starry sky like a silent anthem. Some veterans wiped their eyes. Children giggled and stood taller, understanding somehow the weight of the moment. After the feast, as night unfurled its velvet blanket overhead, Clara and Daniel wandered along the old fence line they had rebuilt with their own hands. Daniel's hand held hers, warm, steady, unspoken. In the distance, the children were tucked into warm beds. Lantern light flickered softly along the porch, lighting the little path back to the garden. Daniel stopped beneath the old maple tree where they had once made promises to each other. "I have an idea," he said, his eyes glinting. "Oh," Clara tilted her head, smiling playfully. "Let's build another small house. Out there, east of the garden, where the sun touches first every morning." She laughed softly. "And who would it be for?" "For anyone who needs a new beginning," Daniel replied. "A single mother, a forgotten veteran, a lost child, anyone searching for a home." Clara squeezed his hand tighter. "I think," she whispered, "Heart's Haven is just getting started." Daniel nodded, resting his forehead lightly against hers. "And we'll build it," he said, "brick by brick, heartbeat by heartbeat." The next morning, as pink dawn brushed the hilltops, Clara awoke to the sound of laughter echoing across the yard. She wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. Charlie was chasing the ranch's newest puppy through the mud. Lily was showing new arrivals how to feed the horses. Hank sat on the old porch swing, strumming a gentle ballad on his guitar. And there, in the center of it all, stood Daniel, hands on his hips, laughing as a child tugged at his jacket, demanding a pony ride. Clara hugged the shawl closer around her, her heart swelling with a profound, quiet joy. Peace, not the polished, picture-perfect kind, but a living, breathing peace stitched together with sweat, tears, laughter, and unwavering faith. Real peace, the kind they had fought for with every beat of their hearts. That afternoon, Daniel mounted a new sign by the front gate. Carved roughly into the weathered wood, the words burned deep into the grain. Heart's Haven, where strangers become family. The entire community gathered around the sign. No grand speeches, just tight embraces, hopeful eyes, and hands reaching for one another, silently, powerfully, more binding than any oath. Clara took Daniel's hand, looking up at the sign. "We found each other," she whispered. "And we'll never lose that," Daniel answered, his grip tightening around hers. That night, as everyone gathered by the bonfire, Daniel pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He stood up, hesitated for a heartbeat, then read aloud. "Not all who wander are lost. Not all with broken wings forget how to fly. Where hearts still dare to feel. Where hands still reach for each other in the long dark. We don't need blood to call each other family. We only need trust, kindness, and one shared roof." When he finished, Heart's Haven fell utterly silent. Then, like a slow, unstoppable tide, the applause broke. Clara ran into Daniel's arms, clutching him tightly. And there, under the vast open sky, surrounded by warm firelight and a sea of stars, they stood, no longer broken pieces but whole. Because sometimes the place you belong isn't made of four walls and a roof. It's a pair of arms that are always open when you need them most. In today's fast-paced world, amid skyscrapers and packed schedules, many of us sometimes feel adrift, as if we're searching for a place to belong without even knowing exactly where it is. The story of Daniel and Clara at Heart's Haven reminds us that true family isn't defined by blood or legal documents, but by hearts that choose to stay together through storms and hope. Today, as the world grows increasingly fragmented, when social media can connect us with a single tap, yet leave us feeling more isolated than ever, the lesson from Heart's Haven becomes more precious than ever. It reminds us that no matter where we come from, no matter how many times we've fallen, as long as we have trust and love, we can always rebuild homes, not just with wooden bricks, but with empathy, forgiveness, and hands reaching out at the right moments. Out there, countless people still need a Heart's Haven in their lives, a place to call home, not because it's perfect, but because it's filled with people willing to accept them with all their scars and unfinished dreams. A compassionate glance, a shared gesture, a silent embrace. Sometimes that's all it takes to begin a new family. Daniel and Clara's story also teaches us that wounds, rather than being endings, can become the foundations for something even more beautiful. In today's life, when facing loss, failure, or betrayal, perhaps the bravest thing we can do is not to shut ourselves away, but to open the door once more to opportunity, to love, and to the unknown. Because in the end, as at Heart's Haven, what truly makes a home isn't the land size, the property value, or how tall the walls stand. A home is made when we find someone to share our first sunrises, our quiet afternoons, and the dreams we haven't yet dared to name. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can offer one another is a simple whisper. Here, you are loved. Here, you are home. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city dreaming of open fields? Drop a comment. Below, I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.